So let me introduce our two panelists. Vincent Albareno is the collections management assistant at OSUL, working with user-submitted requests for materials and streaming video. He received his MA in film studies from the Ohio State University in 2022. A revised version of his thesis was published by Head Press in 2023 as Aesthetic Deviations, a critical view of American shot-on-video horror 1984 to 1994. He continues to independently research and write on underground, amateur, and genre cinema. Letitia Wiggins received her PhD in U.S. history from the Ohio State University in 2016. From there, she worked for several years as a producer at WOSU Public Media, Columbus's NPR PBS affiliate. In 2023, she returned to OSU's campus as the Ethnic Studies librarian, where she liaises with the Center for Ethnic Studies. Her interest in Latin activism in the Midwest continues, as does her interest in finding unique ways of educating the public on intersections between race, class, ethnicity, and gender. So this is our presentation, a case study of ethnic studies media acquisitions in the post-pandemic academic library. There we go.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Johnny.
Thank you. Yes, that was our introduction squared away, so I can just dive right in here. So the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic caused an increased reliance on streaming video within the classroom due to our shift to remote instruction by necessity. And this has continued long after our return to campus, and streaming is now our primary means of video-based instruction and research across OSU and its various satellite campuses. And because of this as well, physical media requests have significantly decreased, and in a lot of instructors' views, to rely on physical media is a regression for instruction these days. I still view these as a necessary part of our collection, but their usage is far less consistent than it was in the pre-pandemic years. All of our requests in any format, but particularly streaming media, are user-driven and based on submissions that I and subject librarians receive. And the main uses of streaming media are for in-classroom instruction and outside the classroom, individual research, and on-campus screenings and events. And these all require either a digital site license or DSL or public performance right, respectively. And these are generally for temporary term periods, usually of 1 or 3 years. However, there are occasional perpetual and life of file options that we make use of to prolong our access to streaming resources.
Awesome. Okay. So it's just really cool to go right after Christine because there's so many parallels that's really exciting to hit on. But I'm going to introduce kind of myself and my role. In the summer of 2023, again, thank you, Johnny, I was hired as the Ethnic Studies librarian for the Ohio State University. My goal in this role was to support Latinx, Native American, and Asian American studies. Not only was I new to the role, but the role itself was new to the university. Undergraduate students pushed for the creation of this position, calling for more research support. OSU's Center for Ethnic Studies also sought library assistance for new faculty acquiring course materials. When I started, acquisitions was a top priority. So it was my first month on the job that the constituent material requests began. Many of these titles were not presented as straightforward book orders. They came for independent films, non-existent ebooks, and difficult to track down titles in general. So this meant that I was in touch with our collections management team within the first week on the job, picking Vincent's brain in particular on ways of accessing these teaching tools. Of all the materials, movies proved to be the trickiest to acquire. In this world where movie titles are generally accessible on some streaming service or another, faculty understandably hold the belief that this ease of streaming should also apply to their students and facilitate streaming videos outside of class. In the case of certain titles, as we found, this is true, but for foreign, independent, and other films that are on a smaller distribution level, this was trickier. So in talking to Vincent, he mentioned how how my faculty requests that I put in were often the most difficult to fulfill. And since then, I've found that my role as a subject librarian has put me in an important liaison position between our collections team and faculty to sort of temper expectations, but also look at why these titles are not accessible.
I'm realizing now that the way this slide shows proceeding is almost how I broke down to Leticia early on in her tenure, how things operate. So this is a good background. We have our existing connections with various academic streaming platforms, Canopy, Swank, Alexander Street, DocuSeek 2, Films on Demand. And since 2020, we've also introduced a lot of new services as well. The primary ones are Criterion Picks, whose works we platform through feature films for education. There's Projector via the New York Public Library System, Lumiere, which is out of UC Berkeley, and Video Data Bank via the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. These are all tied specifically to institutions in a lot of cases, but we also continue to look for new outlets in any form that we can. We also work very regularly with independent distributors and filmmakers to purchase rights and platform the films for our users. And some of these include Women Make Movies, Grasshopper Films, Good Docs, Flickr Alley, and many other smaller outfits. Despite these new opportunities, however, the streaming media landscape is consistently evolving, and rights based acquisitions of titles can prove increasingly difficult in this marketplace. We've encountered, as Leticia mentioned, notable difficulty in accessing films produced outside of the US, and Spanish language films have been our greatest challenge in the last 5 years. And some of these challenges that we've encountered and broken down to help explain to our users are as follows. When licensing foreign films, there's a limited term domestic distribution deal with no aim for long-term availability. A lot of the smaller distributors that did pick up foreign and Spanish language films have dissolved and closed, and the rights to those films they picked up are left uncertain in many cases. A lot of these films never received any theatrical release in the US, especially older titles produced roughly before 2000, we found, and they're confined to physical media releases, which in many cases are out of print and not available. Another kind of tide shift we've experienced are that there are a lot of distributors these days, like Dark Sky Films, Vinegar Syndrome, and their partner labels, who specifically focus on physical media and lack a support for streaming. Where these titles are available in streaming in some form, it's usually via smaller companies or filmmakers who aren't necessarily equipped to license to larger platforms that we work with. And similar to how smaller studios have shuttered, a lot of filmmakers' websites are inactive and they don't have up to date contact information. So we encounter a lot of dead ends just in trying to locate rights holders. Larger distributors have been sold, dissolved, had various shufflings around, and that leaves a lot of their rights tangled up and uncertain. Miramax is the chief example of this for our experience because they supported independent films and a lot of foreign title acquisitions. And just the state of the streaming world as a whole, it's incredibly fractured, and the licenses are generally spread exclusively between just a handful of stakeholders who are often unwilling or unable to license to academic institutions. And we, of course, encounter premium streaming services like Netflix, HBO, Amazon Prime, and many others who just simply don't offer academic streaming options.
So, with this great background, we'd like to share a series of case studies, titles that were requested for streaming license, and point to the varied challenges to academic video licensing. So, to bring up the first film we have here, it's Transfusion. This is the first of the requests that came from a history professor who had been sharing his personal Vimeo login so students could view the film Transfusion. It's a 2014 independent documentary focused on the social issues surrounding taco trucks in Columbus, Ohio, where Ohio State is based. And it served as an important teaching tool for him, bringing issues of immigration, cultural exchange, racialization, and community acceptance to a familiar landscape for students. This is especially important given the dearth of documentary representation of the Latina experience in the Midwest. So he had attempted to request a license for this film 2 years ago and wisely checked in one more time to see if there was any potential of obtaining a streaming copy of the movie with the hopes of no longer having to distribute his personal login information. So then I turned to Vincent, and this is what actually started our lovely correspondence, was this movie.
This film was a perfect example of how the market has changed for independent producers and filmmakers who aren't necessarily equipped to platform their films in a way that's accessible to academic institutions. So, this title being available on Vimeo for rental and purchase, and then other sites that filmmakers make use of, like YouTube, they're great and they benefit the artists themselves, but they're not necessarily compatible with how OSUL as an academic institution has to make its videos available and license them. And this really speaks to the difficulties of distribution and how the realities are very different for filmmakers and libraries trying to platform and access their work. And this is just a perfect example in its inavailability of why it's important for us to renew searching efforts and stay on top of these titles as they come in. And a smaller note within this is that the sharing of the Vimeo login also touches on some copyright issues that we do encounter fairly often and continue to prove a challenge for unavailable titles.
Awesome. And I also have to note that my faculty in the Latinx Studies department are very active. So we talked about Spanish language films being the most difficult to secure since we are such a user request driven space. That might be part of it, but it is just an interesting thing to note real quickly. So, a month after the request for transfusion, I received another urgent streaming video request for the 2014 documentary film Las Marthas. This is directed by Christine Ibarra and delves into the realm of Mexican American debutante balls. The professor wanted to assign this immediately as an extra credit assignment for her folklore class. She noticed that this title was available on the main Canopy website, but not OSU's Canopy service. So there was confusion as to why we didn't have it while it was on the main Canopy site. Again, I turned to Vincent, and as someone who was still learning the streaming video world myself, I was also curious why we didn't have the video at OSU and whether we would be able to access it quickly. So it turns out this question is a really common one and would become a common one as I would continue to receive video requests for titles that were unavailable on Canopy as accessed through Columbus Public Library, but not at our own library at OSU.
Canopy is a platform that we use very extensively, and we subscribe to a number of packages, but a large deal of our acquisitions there are a la carte, just film by film basis. And if you've used the platform, you might notice that there is an institutional version and a non institutional version that's more exclusive to non academic libraries. And this is where Las Marthas was originally found. It was the Columbus Metropolitan Library's listing of Las Marthas, where it was accessible but would not show up in our catalog. And this is just a good representation of the available options that are not necessarily available to OSU and its libraries. And this does emphasize the benefits of individual and personal access to streaming platforms that can work where the library is unable to provide access. However, this was a unique success for us in that Las Marthas was available for us to license via the institutional version of Canopy, and this is rarely the case and somewhat confusing to explain. So this was a good exchange between Leticia and I and the requester, just to show how communication and clearly explaining these events can really make a difference in providing access.
So, for a Latinx literature and culture class, the same professor that we just spoke about hoped to discuss the movie La Misión. This 2009 film was at one point streaming on Canopy and then mysteriously disappeared. So, I thought this could be a situation like Las Marthas, where once again the title may be accessible. It was in the Canopy lexicon. especially given the fact that this was a US drama. Very Hollywood actor Benjamin Bratt was in it. I assumed that licensing for this film would not be a problem. Yet we both found that my assumption was wrong. Just because something used to be on Canopy did not mean this would always be the case.
This was a perfect example of how slippery the status to film rights can be and how titles can fall out of availability. And in a lot of those cases, we aren't made aware of when a platform might lose a license or access to a film. And that's where it falls on us to socialize the current tumultuous status of video availability and make clear that we are subject to term periods for a lot of these films. And also just the larger reality that there's not much we can do if a film leaves without our knowledge. And in a lot of cases, as with La Mission, it may not be available for streaming in any form. And to this day, it's still not rentable or purchasable through any legitimate channel.
So yes, and I love to like we'll have a success at the end, but it's like it's cool to have a couple successes and then showcase the failures, right? But for the film Promised Land, it was a professor in comparative studies who wrote in with this request for an educational license. It's a documentary that follows two contemporary fights for indigenous sovereignty and federal recognition from the Chinook and Duwamish people in the Pacific Northwest. The film was to be viewed in an Intro to American Studies course, and the professor was hoping for a streaming version to allow the class to view it at home. Again, I turned to Vincent to check in about streaming availability. Were there some instances where DVD was the only option?
Similar to Transfusion, the first film we collaborated on, Promised Land was available for streaming on the filmmaker's personal Vimeo page for rental and a license fee. However, they weren't equipped to make it available to any academic institution, or they had not sought out that process. So that's another example of how we can't always accommodate these newer streaming platforms if they're not through an official channel like some of the platforms we work with. Another issue with this is that communications just to determine whether that Vimeo link could be translated to an actual license can take several months or even longer if we even receive a response in many cases. And sometimes this can exceed the period that the film is needed. However, as the image shows from the filmmaker's website itself, it is offered for institutional purchase on DVD and Blu-ray, which is something that we always encourage as it's an outlet for continued availability in our collection. And we do generally try to support the filmmakers directly and benefit them through these purchases as well.
So we wanted to wrap up these case studies with a recent success. Sleep Dealer is a 2008 film by Alex Rivera. It's a futuristic sci-fi film imagining a dystopic future where technology, robots specifically, complicate the migrant paradigm between the US and Mexico. This is a film that is heavily requested by many professors in Latinx studies. And so somebody requested it again this year with the hopes they could actually add it to their syllabus.
And this is possibly the most complex example that we've collaborated on because the first submission I received for a sleep dealer in my position was before Leticia had begun at OSU. It was an open task for 6 months without a response, and we closed it because it didn't prove to be available. Shortly after she started working at OSUL, she submitted it on behalf of another requester showing the high demand for this title. And that's where we were able to uncover a bit more through our workflow, namely that it was distributed by Maya Entertainment, just like La Mission, who are no longer operational. But this was a title available for paid streaming rentals, which listed Cinedigm. However, they're more of a subscription service and not something that we can work with. So ultimately, we were able to uncover that the film is offered via Subcine, who did still take several months to respond to our inquiries and locate a means of platforming it. But we did manage to license the film. It's currently accessible in our catalog, as you can see there. And that just really illustrates how persistent searching and trying to be optimistic and always encouraging curiosity from our user base is the key to success in a lot of these cases.
Awesome. Thanks, Vincent. So I just wanted to kind of bring up this responding to needs. I don't think I started this job thinking that I'd have like such a opportunity like this. Thank you everybody for presenting at something like this conference. It's really amazing to be new to this world, but be made aware of all that goes into licensing these films. It's a huge part of my job now. So ultimately, working with this has strengthened my relationships with faculty and ameliorated my practice. I've started to circulate emails, so this is just kind of like what I've learned from this process each semester, and they've mentioned licensing times for streaming video. That way faculty know that licensing is not all created equal. It can range from as quick as 24 hours to not being possible at all. Hopefully getting ahead of these requests will lessen disappointment mid-semester. Vince and I have also been working on an FAQ page. Well, he's been working on it and I will help review it, but I have a lot of the FAQs. They involve different obstacles just to have a little more context for what the process it looks like. Explaining the acquisitions process has been instrumental for faculty members. Going through the reasons why we can't acquire things is humanizing the library for them. So now faculty are way more understanding once they realize their requests are not being fed into a robotic system. It's an acquisitions team doing the detective work and navigating unique licensing regulations for each film. And this is honestly shown in the emails that they send me now. It's not like, hey, get this. It's like, hey, do you think that this would be available? That's been a huge shift since I started. Finally, working with Vincent and facing these challenges has led to other wins, which is ultimately expanding our collection of films, even if it's challenging, for these subject areas that are in many ways under attack with the current political climate. We are pushing for more representation in our collections of often marginalized communities. And I'll have, like, my position was created to do this very thing. So that's why it's interesting that we face these challenges, but we're still working to persevere with in all of that.
And what this really amounts to is streaming is a changing landscape for the academic library world. These examples we've run down comprise just a fraction of our requests. We encounter a lot of difficulty with short films. Series are very difficult. A lot of East Asian titles have also been a challenge. So, what this really emphasizes is that the streaming landscape itself is constantly in flux. And what that means for us and the work that we have to do is to keep our patron base informed about the current realities. That way, they're better prepared for their own teaching needs. And the way to do this is via clear communication, assistance with any questions they have on platforms, the status of film rights, and especially the guidance toward alternatives. Because regardless of the belief that streaming is the path forward and physical media might be a regression, this is still a very new phenomenon and it's not codified. And for various business reasons, it will continue to change. Yeah, thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you everybody for this opportunity.